8 months of silence. 8 months of conspiracy theories, manufactured outrage, and screaming hot takes from accounts that have never seen the inside of a WNBA locker room. Then, without a press conference, without a PR statement, without a single carefully crafted post for the algorithm, Caitlin Clark laced up her signature sneakers at Gainbridge Fieldhouse and turned one single training camp practice into the most definitive statement any player has made before a regular season tip-off in recent league memory. What happened inside that building was not a cautious athlete testing the waters after a brutal injury stretch. It was a hostile takeover, quiet, methodical, and completely devastating to every narrative that spent the past week trying to rewrite the Indiana Fever's power structure from the outside. Caitlin Clark did not return to prove she could survive at this level. She returned to make absolutely clear that the conspiracy theories were not just wrong, they were embarrassing in their wrongness. Today we are breaking down everything the internet got wrong about Clark, Raven Johnson, Stephanie White, and the Indiana Fever, and exactly what Day One reveals about what this team is actually capable of doing this season. There is a lot to unpack, and none of it looks anything like the panic narrative that dominated your timeline this week. If this is the kind of analysis that filters out the manufactured noise and gets straight to what is actually happening on the hardwood, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm you're here for the real investigation, and it helps us keep bringing you this level of depth every single time a major story breaks. Let's establish what Clark walked back into, because without understanding the full physical and psychological weight she was carrying through those double doors, you cannot fully appreciate the magnitude of what she just pulled off. Clark's rookie season ended with her body paying the complete price of being the lone offensive engine for a franchise that simply lacked the roster depth to share that load. Groin issues accumulated through the mid-season stretch, quad strains layered on top, ankle sprains completed the sequence, none of it resulted from a single incident. Every injury was the direct product of being physically targeted across an entire season by teams that had identified one viable strategy for slowing her down: make every possession as physically expensive as possible and trust that the cumulative damage would eventually break her rhythm. Medical reality dictates that cascading soft tissue injuries in the lower body are among the most difficult to fully recover from. The body develops unconscious protective mechanisms during rehabilitation, fractional hesitations in movement patterns, slight adjustments in weight distribution during explosive actions that show up on film for months after the physical healing is technically complete. Almost every player who has returned from that volume of compounded soft tissue damage has shown some measurable version of rust in their first practices. Back Clark showed zero rust. None, not a moment of it. What she brought through those Gainbridge Fieldhouse doors was the direct product of how she spent the months between the end of her rookie season and day one of camp, because the FIBA World Cup qualifiers in Puerto Rico last month were not a soft rehabilitation exercise designed to ease her back into competitive action. They were a full-intensity international test against elite, physically organized competition, and she treated them accordingly against Senegal, a defense specifically calibrated to collapse on ball handlers and apply maximum physicality to every possession. Clark posted 17 points and 12 assists in 19 minutes of playing time, connecting on 4 of 5 attempts from beyond the arc. Let that production rate sit for a moment. 19 minutes, those numbers don't just exceed what anyone had a rational right to expect from a player, still technically working through a recovery timeline. They break the analytical expectations for a fully healthy player operating at the peak of their game. She walked away from Puerto Rico as the undisputed FIBA tournament MVP. She walked into a Fever training camp carrying every ounce of that international confidence as a direct launching pad for everything that followed. Now, let's address the specific narratives day one. Just obliterated. Because understanding what the conspiracy crowd was actually claiming is essential to understanding the scale of the statement Clark made by simply playing basketball. The dominant theory, pushed relentlessly across WNBA social media for the past week, was that Indiana's front office was engaged in a deliberate, structured campaign to diminish Clark's role from generational point guard to perimeter specialist. The evidence cited came in 2 specific pieces: the draft selection of Raven Johnson, a defensive-oriented guard, and the coaching change that moved Christy Sides out and brought Stephanie White in as head coach. That coaching transition deserves far more analytical attention than it received in the heat of the drama cycle, because it is genuinely significant basketball context. Christy Sides presided over a 20-20 record in Clark's rookie season. For a rebuilding team still constructing its identity, that record had real merit. For a franchise that had just acquired the most commercially and athletically significant player in the modern history of the league, it was a floor, not a ceiling. The organizational decision to bring in Stephanie White was a philosophical recalibration, a deliberate move toward a coaching identity built on adaptable system basketball and intelligent roster deployment. The conspiracy theory layered on top of that change argued that White would impose a rigid structure that quietly suffocated Clark's instincts, that she would prioritize coach-first system execution over the free-flowing, vision-driven playmaking that makes Clark functionally impossible to guard when she has the ball in her hands and space to operate. Day one delivered the most efficient possible answer to that argument. Clark ran the offense completely and without constraint from the opening possession forward. Full point guard control. The coaching staff did not rein anything in. There was nothing to rein in, only basketball being executed at a level that makes interference counterproductive for everyone present. When you're pushing transition at a pace that leaves defenders gasping before they can establish position, finding backdoor cutters, before the cutters themselves have finished processing the decision, delivering no-look passes through windows that appear physically impossible until the ball is already through them and pulling up from 35 feet, with the casual certainty of someone who has made that shot 1,000 times. You are not requesting the keys to the franchise. You are demonstrating that the entire conversation about the keys was always fictional. Here's the perspective that genuinely matters as historical context. The WNBA is 30 years old, and the league has never seen a player who combines Clark's passing vision, shooting range from distances that redefine what the three-point line means, court reading at full transition speed, and the commercial gravity she generates simply by being in a Fever uniform. The conspiracy theories about limiting her role were not just analytically wrong about basketball strategy, they fundamentally misread the financial and competitive reality of what Clark represents to this franchise and to the entire league infrastructure that depends on the growth she is driving. You do not limit the asset that is generating the commercial expansion of your entire organization. You build around it, protect it, and then make absolutely certain that everything surrounding it is good enough to maximize what it can produce. That last point is where the real story of this training camp begins, because the roster Caitlin Clark walked onto on day one is not the roster she was forced to carry last season. Every move made this offseason has been constructed with a single architectural purpose: give the most talented player in the league the surrounding infrastructure to actually compete for a championship, not just make the conversation compelling. Aaliyah Boston is locked in on a 4-year, $6.3 million extension, the largest financial commitment to a front-court player in Indiana Fever franchise history. Kelsey Mitchell returns on a $1.4 million Supermax deal after averaging 20.2 points per game last season. Sophie Cunningham brings the perimeter enforcement mentality that sends a deterrent message to every player in the league who spent last year thinking cheap shot fouling on Clark was a viable defensive strategy. And a rookie class anchored by Justine Pellington, 6'4", 42% from three-point range in college, signals an organization thinking not about surviving this season, but about the full trajectory of Clark's prime years. The roster breakdown is exactly where we are going next, and the numbers embedded in these contracts tell a story that the conspiracy crowd was too committed to its own narrative to ever honestly examine. Before we get into the roster architecture and what Raven Johnson actually looked like on that practice floor, drop a comment right now with your prediction for the Indiana Fever's regular season record. Whether you think this team goes deep into the playoffs, or whether you think the new system creates early friction before the roster fully coheres, we want to hear your read on this right now. The comment section on this one is going to be appointment reading. Let's start with Raven Johnson, because the actual court reality of her day one performance was the single most decisive piece of evidence against the entire conspiracy framework, and it was delivered in the quietest possible way. Johnson was not running the point guard position while Clark stood frozen in the corner. She was not directing offensive sets. She was not operating as a second primary ball handler competing for the role that defines Clark's value to this team. She was doing exactly what a point-of-attack defensive specialist is drafted to do, applying relentless physical pressure on the ball, bringing a gritty physical dimension to a perimeter defense that had been statistically exploitable throughout Clark's rookie season, and doing all of it without a single visible moment of intimidation, despite walking into the most media-saturated practice environment in WNBA history. The WNBA discourse spent 7 consecutive days constructing an imaginary hostile locker room, a cold power struggle between two guards fighting for the same oxygen, an explosive first-day confrontation that would confirm every whispered theory about front office sabotage. The actual practice floor delivered 2 elite professionals operating in complementary roles, communicating through screens, competing in scrimmages, and producing absolutely nothing that the drama farming accounts could weaponize. Aaliyah Boston said it precisely on her podcast before camp even opened. Fans and media always carry far more conflict than the actual players do. She was 100% correct. Clark ran the offense. Johnson disrupted on the defensive end. The roles were designed for each other, and day one confirmed the design works. Now let's examine what this roster structure actually does to opposing defensive coordinators during film sessions, because the financial commitments embedded in these contracts tell a specific story about how Clark's second season is going to operate mechanically at the possession level. The Aaliyah Boston and Clark pick-and-roll partnership is already one of the analytically least solvable actions in the modern WNBA. When Boston sets a screen at the level, the defense faces an immediate sequence of bad choices. Go over the screen and give Clark a full downhill runway to the rim, go under it, and gift her a pull-up three from the logo with clean feet and no hand in her face. Switch and put a perimeter-sized defender in position to get physically dominated by a player locked into a $6.3 million extension who averaged double figures and played with the physical IQ of a veteran throughout Clark's rookie season. None of those defensive options produce good results. All of them generate above-average offensive outcomes for Indiana on a statistically reliable basis. Kelsey Mitchell waiting on the wing as that action develops is the secondary consequence mechanism that makes the entire structure mathematically oppressive. Any team that collapses two defenders toward Clark at half court is explicitly choosing to leave a player who averaged 20.2 points per game standing wide open without a contest. Mitchell does not function as a secondary option in those possessions. She functions as the primary beneficiary of every defensive overcommitment, and opposing coaches know that, which means they have to choose between stopping Clark and stopping Mitchell. There is no scheme that simultaneously solves both problems. Real quick, if this roster-level breakdown is what keeps you coming back here for analysis rather than noise, consider joining the channel as a member. Every member directly funds our ability to keep going this deep into the numbers and the actual game film rather than recycling the takes that everyone else is already serving. Sophie Cunningham's addition to this backcourt configuration is the most analytically underappreciated move the Fever made this offseason, and here's why. The physical targeting of Clark throughout her rookie season was not random aggressive play. Teams had identified a documented pattern, apply consistent, accumulated physical pressure across 40 minutes, and the compounding fatigue measurably affects her decision-making in the fourth quarters where playoff basketball is actually decided. Cunningham's presence on the floor communicates a deterrent message that no play designer can scheme away from. She is also a genuine shooting threat from the outside who demands defensive attention, meaning she is not simply a roster allocation for protection purposes. She is a legitimate perimeter weapon who makes the spacing around Clark more dangerous while simultaneously making the cheap shot calculus for opposing players exponentially more complicated. Lexi Hull shot 47% from three-point range in lineups that featured Clark last season. That correlation is not a coincidence. It is the direct statistical output of Clark's gravity forcing defenders to prioritize stopping her over closing out on shooters in the corners and on the wings. Monique Billings provides the vertical rebounding physicality that sustains offensive possessions in the half-court sets where modern WNBA playoff basketball is ultimately won or lost. The grinding possessions where second-chance points separate teams in close series. Maisha Hines-Allen brings championship-caliber post-passing and genuinely high basketball IQ from a position that almost never generates that quality of creation at the professional level. Tasha Harris provides veteran backcourt stability off the bench for the stretches when Clark needs rest and the offense cannot afford to collapse in her absence. And then there is rookie Justine Pellington, 6'4", 42% from three-point range in college, and a floor-stretching presence whose size and shooting combination pushes defenses into structural compromises that benefit every player sharing the court with her. She represents the organizational intelligence of an operation that is not building for one season. The Fever are investing in the full window of Clark's prime years, and the roster construction reflects exactly that timeline. If you have Indiana Fever fans in your orbit who spent the past week convinced the front office had completely lost the plot, share this video with them right now, because the evidence from day one suggests the organizational plan is far more coherent than anything the panic cycle was willing to examine. Honestly, here is the piece of this equation that is not getting adequate analytical weight heading into this season, and it is arguably the most important factor of all. Caitlin Clark is not returning from injury as a player who is grateful to be back and relieve the worst is over. She is returning as a player who absorbed 8 consecutive months of disrespect narratives, questioning her power within her own franchise, questioning whether the coaching change was designed to work against her, questioning whether her rookie season was going to be dismissed as a product of novelty rather than genuine elite-level talent, and then responded to all of it not with words, but with a FIBA tournament MVP performance in Puerto Rico and a day one practice that left zero ambiguity about where power in this organization actually resides. The chip on her shoulder entering May 9th is not a media construction, it is the natural psychological consequence of an entire offseason built around the premise that something fundamental had shifted against her. Nothing shifted. The basketball confirmed it definitively. And here is what every defensive coordinator preparing game plans for Indiana this season needs to sit with: a generational talent, operating at full physical health, surrounded by the deepest and most talented roster she has ever had, carrying 9 months of accumulated motivation that she never publicly addressed. That is not a team that sneaks into a playoff conversation. That is a team that arrives at the bracket and makes every seeded opponent feel like they were not prepared for what just showed up. Heat preseason opener against the Dallas Wings on April 25th is the first public pressure test. The regular season tips off on May 9th. The bold prediction goes on the record right now. This Indiana Fever team is going to shock the entire basketball world this season, not because of anything the front office says in a press release, not because of a coaching philosophy memo, and not because of the commercial machinery surrounding the franchise. It will be because Caitlin Clark, fully healthy, fully motivated, and surrounded by elite shooting on every wing and a legitimate enforcer in the backcourt, is operating with a level of combined internal drive and external weaponry that the WNBA has simply never seen concentrated in one roster. Stephanie White's rotation decisions in those preseason games against Dallas will tell us whether the promise of day one is a system-level commitment or an opening session performance for the cameras. That breakdown drops the moment the preseason buzzer sounds. If you want to be here when we pull apart every possession of that opener, every rotation call White makes, every signal she sends about how she actually intends to deploy this roster when the pressure is real and the lights are on. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. The investigation that started today has a long way to run. We will see you at the preseason opener.